when you begin to discover the ancient stories, you begin to find the roots of the biblical stories, and you think, oh my goodness, we've been lied to. Academics in the Christian world have known that so many of our God's stories are based on Mesopotamian stories of sky people. They've known that nearly 200 years by this point. How is it that information has not been passed on to the rank and file of the churches? How is it that in 2025 that these God stories are based on someone else's stories of sky people? And
Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to Your Superior Self. Today, I am joined with one of my favorites, Paul Wallis. Paul, thank you so much for taking the time, my friend.
G'day, Trey. It's great to be with you again.
Yes, sir. Your new book is out, The Eden Enigma, and I have to say that every time I prepare myself for one of your books, I have to say, like, I go down all these different rabbit holes, and it comes at a very perfect time for me because it's all about ancient cultures, um, and possible alien contact. And for me, recently, I've been diving back into kind of making my own contact in my backyard with phenomena, UAPs, UFOs, whatever you want to call it. So I'm interested very much in this topic right now. Like, what is the correlation between us today and the ancient civilizations back then? And why are we seeing so much more activity now? I don't know. Maybe I'm just recognizing it more now, but like it seems to be picking up in speed. So your book comes out at a perfect time in my life. So thank you for doing that, my friend.
Oh, a pleasure. And I think you're right to flag that question of contact behind closed doors versus contact that people like you and I and regular people all around the world are experiencing. What does that level of contact mean? And I think there are other contact phenomena that regular people experience from week to week, month to month, all around the world that we don't necessarily recognize as being contact or close encounter experiences. When we talk about contact, I mean, there's a great spectrum. You can have, I saw a craft in the sky, it landed, a being stepped out and we interacted, classic close encounter. But then I think there are experiences that people are having of, well, people often say to me, I'm beginning to suspect I've got company. I'm beginning to suspect I've got an invisible guide or an invisible team of guides. And I think some of these kinds of experiences that in the past we might just have brushed off as experiences of our subconscious or our higher self might also be contact experiences. I certainly know from my study of primitive Christianity that early Christians were experiencing communication phenomena that did not fit in the paradigm of God, the Holy Spirit, the believer living in this tiny bubble, and that's where all the communication happens. They were experiencing contact with other kinds of entity, whom the writer of 1 John 4 calls spirits, and that fits into a global phenomenon of contact experiences once you get into the folklore and into the shamanic traditions of traditional cultures. So I would put all those phenomena on the table and say, I think we're looking at contact experiences. And I think when we do that, it's a more positive and encouraging picture that emerges than if we're just focused on, yeah, but what isn't the Pentagon telling us?
Yeah, 100%. So a lot of your research comes from Turkey in this book. You talk about some of the structures that you visited and some of the ancient civilizations associated with them and the carvings that are at these locations, which I find fascinating because Turkey is, to me, like I took a spiritual and more so spiritual psychology class last fall, and I didn't realize like the amount of how our origin story started in Turkey. Like a lot of our ancient civilizations, like Göbekli Tepe, right? Like how that pushed back our timeline of agriculture and just the carvings in that in itself and how magnificent they are. Like I wonder if like Göbekli Tepe is like some type of calendar almost. Like I was looking at the carvings and you pointed out the handbags and the pine cones in your new book. Um, any correlation? Because there are handbags, I think, in the Göbekli Tepe carvings, as well as the site that you visited. But why don't you go ahead and start there? Give some context. Like, why were you in Turkey? Before I jump the gun, like, why were you in Turkey? What were you researching? What were you looking for?
For sure. Well, quick, short answer. Yes, there are handbags in Göbekli Tepe, which we'll come back to a little later. But when I went to Turkey, I fully expected to find some references to the story of a cataclysm and reboot experience, because there are so many vectors pointing to the lands of ancient Armenia, which would comprise modern Turkey and Armenia and Syria. And the reason I would not be surprised is if you read Snorri Sturluson writing in the 1200s, he's the post-Viking chieftain through whom we know all the stories of the Viking gods, the Aesir. He points to what he called Asaland, we would call it ancient Armenia, and said that Odin and the families with him were an advanced culture who migrated from there into Northwest Europe, into Scandinavia and Iceland. And the beginning of that story is ancient Armenia. So he's pointing in that direction. Moses Koronatsi, who's the sort of original historian of the Armenian people, says that their people began there as a result of a repopulation through the family lines of Haik, who was a descendant of Hapet. We might know him as Japheth, one of the sons of Noah. So he's referring back to the biblical story and saying, our regional history is rooted in something that happened that's referenced in the Bible. And that's a proud claim of the Armenian people, the Haya. And then if you listen to classical writers, Roman and Greek historians, they point to ancient Armenia and say it was here that humanity made the great leap forward into iron technology. This is where the Iron Age began, and modern day archaeology has found the earliest artifacts of iron technology in ancient Armenia. There are other vectors. If you go into modern Armenia, you will find the earliest vineyard. That's the claim. And this keys back to an ancient story we can find in the book of Genesis, saying the first vineyard was planted in the region of Ararat. So I was expecting to find references to this. The biblical story, of course, points there. Ararat is where Noah's Ark comes to a rest on Mount Ararat, and there's a rebooting of the human story from there. It's also a claim made by the Babylonian story of Ziusudra. Ziusudra, in his craft, lands on Mount Ararat, and there's a reboot from there. And there's an intriguing little verse in the book of Ezekiel that says that the garden of the powerful ones, which may be a reference to the Eden story, was in the high country of the powerful ones. And the word for high country is Ur, became Urartu. The kingdom of Urartu is written up in the Bible as Ararat. So I expected to find some reference to all these stories when I went to Turkey. And when I got there, I was impacted by how much had been lost of the Bronze Age culture that lived there, the people of Urartu, the United Kingdom of Van. And at first I thought, gosh, there's not going to be a lot to see here because so much is missing. But when we got to the special sites of Chavez Tepe and Kefkalesi and Ioannis, and then in the Eden Enigma, we also go over the border into Armenia to Yerevan and Karahunj. What they did leave behind, symbols carved into basalt, cuneiform inscriptions left in the hardness of basalt so that it's crystal clear 3,000 years later. Those symbols and those inscriptions, when you read them alongside each other, tell a very coherent story that relates to cataclysm, reboot, and then gets into very surprising detail at what the help was that their ancestors received from non-human others to get the human story moving again. And that's where I go in the Eden Enigma. I go into the symbols That's why it's called Enigma, because I'm decoding the symbols and going into the cuneiform, listening to the stories they left behind. Stories that are 3,000 years old, but refer us back to an experience far deeper in the timeline of humanity, just on this side of the most recent ice age.
Mm, I love that, all that, the mystery behind it, right? Like the whole mystery.
I love the mystery of it as well. And I try to avoid writing books that say, this is how it is. Here's the definitive answer, because that's just boring, isn't it? Because, no further thought needed. Whereas if I find mystery and I share the experience of going into that mystery and beginning to decode bits of it, what I hope that does is whet the reader's appetite to look at this for themselves and make a journey for themselves.
Do you think we're facing the same type of reset right now? That's why we're seeing a lot more activity in the skies?
I think one of the reasons we're seeing a lot of activity is that there are far more um, non-human demographics, let's put it that way, sitting at the table of what the Bible called the Sky Council than there were in the deep past. I think we've got a lot of groups who feel they have a stakeholding in planet Earth, and the compacts that have bound them together, notwithstanding their conflicting agendas and interests, I think are leaking like a sieve at the moment. And I think there is a bit of a tussle as to how Project Earth is going to move forward. And I think the agreements to do with non-disclosure are leaking like a sieve, which is why we've seen official soft disclosure for the last 6 years or so, almost as an insurance against uh, covert contact suddenly becoming overt and it becoming blindingly obvious that we're in contact. So I think things are more complicated than the world that was described for us by the ancestors, albeit if you read about the Sky Council in the Bible, or you read about the kings in the Vedas, or you read about the Anunnaki in the Babylonian stories, they will tell you already at that stage, and that's referring to experiences maybe tens of thousands of years old, that there was already conflict among these other powers as to how Project Earth should be managed. And I think it's only got more complicated in the aeons since.
Sure. So your work, I feel like I picked up your work in a very special time in my development, consciously. You brought me to these chapters in the Bible that talked about the Yahweh and the Elohim and these councils, and the more that I look at it, at first it made me angry because I felt like I had been lied to, a little bit. But then the more and more I read it, it was just like it's more like you're gaining a greater perspective, right? Because like just for an example, I just picked up recently. I picked it back up just to kind of find like the hidden messages and meanings in the Bible. So I'm reading like Job and just trying to like, what can I take from Job, right? And at the very beginning of Job, he's talking about the sons of God. Like God comes and there's the sons of God and there's this Satan. It's like the sons of God, right? In my
Yeah.
interpretation of Christianity, there was only one son of God, right? Like that was in the New Testament. So
Yes.
there's what are your thoughts on Job? Because I've been really, and I know this is not about your book, but like I've been just racking my mind about how I can metaphorically create a message of like, how the devil affected Job in the way that, he took all his objective material belongings away from him, even some of his children, and then he attacked his skin and his physicality, and how that tested his faith. And then the behemoth, like what is that? Is that like metaphor for our true essence, our soul, our, the higher being that we are within, that nothing can touch us? You're the man for the job on this one. So I just wanted to throw that at you.
Well, yes, you get to the book of Job, and it really, to use an English phrase, throws you a wobbly, because it seems to be coming from a world that has nothing to do with what you've read so far, if you've been reading one of the familiar translations of the Bible, because here all of a sudden are these Bene Elohim. Who are they? And it gets translated as the sons of God. But as I point out from the first book in the Eden series, the word Elohim doesn't mean God. The root meaning of that word is powerful ones. It's a plural form noun, masculine plural form noun, and very often it takes plural verbs and exhibits plural behaviors. The Elohim talk to each other, they conflict with one another, they go to war against one another, they are jealous of one another. Yahweh, one of the Elohim, says he's a jealous Elohim, and we know why he's jealous, because in Psalm 82 and Deuteronomy 32, all the other Elohim seem to get land with the resources under the land and the people on the land, and Yahweh only gets a people group with no land, no resources, and so his story has to begin with warring against the other Elohim to get some resources for himself and for his people group. So all this is lost when we translate the word Elohim as God. And when we come to Job, we think, who are these other beings? They've been referenced before. If we're reading the Bible in its current order, beginning in Genesis, they're referenced in Genesis 6. The Bene Elohim, the sons of the powerful ones, literally, are the beings who come down from the sky, from space, and hybridize with human females. So they are physical beings, similar enough to us to be able to hybridize with our females, but different enough that the offspring are different. They don't have a growth inhibitor, they become gigantic. That's the story of Genesis 6. So here, this phrase recurs in the book of Job. And I should say, we read the books of the Bible in a certain order today, but there are lots of scholars who would argue that the book of Job is actually the earliest piece of writing that we have that made its way into the Hebrew canon. So the Bene Elohim, I argue, in Escaping from Eden, doesn't literally mean the sons of the powerful ones. I think it means it in a figurative sense, ones like the powerful ones. It's used in the sense of sons and daughters of the Mayflower, for instance, or sons and daughters of the Revolution. These are the ones with those characteristics, the ones like the Elohim. And in Genesis 6, it's like the second wave of powerful beings who turn up. So here they are again in the book of Job, and they're having a conversation. And I think any believer who reads the beginning of Job is left scratching their head, because it sounds like two naughty boys toying with an ant, seeing what happens if you put it under a magnifying glass. That's the kind of conversation these beings are having about this poor person Job and what they're going to do to him, and find out what the result is. And it's one of those clues that perhaps there's another story here. Perhaps there's a framework that makes sense of this experience that has not been explained in the Bible as we know it. And I totally relate to what you were saying, Trey, about this phase of anger. When you begin to discover the ancient stories, you begin to find the roots of the biblical stories, and you think, oh my goodness, we've been lied to. Academics in the Christian world have known that so many of our God's stories are based on Mesopotamian stories of sky people. They've known that for nearly 200 years by this point. How is it that information has not been passed on to the rank and file of the churches? How is it that in 2025, a lot of people, when they want to defend God or defend Jesus, feel they have to defend a fundamentalist reading of the Bible? How has it not been explained to those people that these God stories are based on someone else's stories of sky people? And I went through a phase of anger at that as well, because of the dishonesty and the cowardice. But you have to get to the other side of it and say, okay, so this is the picture of things. What am I going to do now? And I find I go back to the scriptures of the Bible with huge respect, because the original writers of those scriptures didn't lie to us. What's gone wrong is our interpretation of them. What's gone wrong is our translation of them. And even when you start talking about how the Hebrew scriptures were redacted to obliterate the memory of these extraterrestrial beings, this redaction happened between the 8th and 6th century BCE. In the Bible, that's actually done openly. If you read the books of Ezekiel, Jeremiah, 1 and 2 Kings, and Ezra, the Bible itself tells you how the narrative was changed to become monotheism and to try and stamp out the memory of these other beings. So there's a great transparency and honor, I think, to the Hebrew scriptures that stands you and me in good stead if we're trying to get back to what did the writers originally mean, what were the experiences originally described. And I think the Bible is one of the greatest resources if you're looking for ancestral story that opens up the world of paleo contact.
Mm. Can you talk about the carvings that you found in Turkey regarding the paleo contact? Like, how do you know that's what they're describing in these carvings?
For sure. Well, the Urartian people, so that's the culture that was in Turkey and Armenia in the Bronze Age, in that's 3,000 years ago, basically. They told stories about what had happened in their region. And every place that a king puts up a cuneiform inscription at one of their citadels, he talks about the transformation of the land from barren desert into fertile farmland. And this was done thanks to the input from specific beings: Haldi, Arubani, Irmashini, Suini, Teshaba, at about 47 altogether of these beings, whom they called Tingir. Now, traditionally, we would say, the Tingir, that's spelt Digir, are the gods of the Urartian people. But when we translate that story and use the English word gods, we distort it, because if I say God, we'll be thinking of a supernatural, almighty, transcendent, probably imagined being. That wasn't what the Urartians meant by the word Tingir. Tingir were advanced people, advanced beings who lived among their ancestors in the deep past and enabled them to make the great leap forward into agricultural science, which is absolutely essential if you're going to establish dense populations, settled communities, specialized society, and become a civilization. So that's the story told. They didn't worship them as gods. They remembered them with love and gratitude, but they didn't worship them. They were finite beings, so they're associated with the weather, but they only had finite powers over the weather. And the story that emerges is that the Tingir arrived at a time when something had happened to the ecosphere, something had happened to the ecosystem that meant that the people living there were just scavenging and surviving. There was no farming. They couldn't get it to work. And in the Eden Enigma, I show that's because they were just on this end of an ice age. And so all the insect life that normally goes around pollinating and cross-pollinating our plants, enabling a plant with a flower to become a plant with a fruit, and enabling a plant that harvests this year to harvest next year, all that had to be done artificially. And the key carvings that I found in Turkey, represented as paintings in Armenia, and very finessed carvings in what is now Iran, show these Tingir, who look like human beings other than the fact that they have wings. And what they are doing is hand pollinating plants. And the plants are shown not thriving in the wild. They're shown in what looks like clinical lab conditions, and they're being hand pollinated. Why? Because they've had to bring plants from elsewhere into the environment. The insect life isn't there to do it. So they're doing this, and they are cross pollinating to create new strains of plant that can thrive in the new environment. And once you've got that going, you've got agriculture. And hot on the heels of agriculture is civil engineering and megalithic building. And when we look at the archaeological record and DNA history, we can see this massive leap forward into agriculture in southeast Turkey, which then migrates into the Baltic. And that's about 10,000 years ago, then migrates into the Baltic states, Northwest Europe, Scandinavia, Iceland, Northern Ireland. And that's the story that I follow in the Eden Enigma.
I love it. So they give us this information, this technology, right? Do you think
It
they
relates,
influence?
by the way, because a lot
Good.
of people listening to our conversation will know about some of these carvings. It relates to the pine cone and the bucket, or the pine cone and the handbag, that people have often had deep conversations about what that might represent. And I think in a later age, those two emblems came to represent all the benefits of this external intervention. In a previous stage, they became religious accoutrements, purification ceremonies used those. But in the beginning, this is what I show in the Eden Enigma, in the beginning, they were agricultural tools used in the process of hand pollination.
So agricultural tools for hand pollination. So because I've heard you say that people represent or correlate the pine cone to the pineal gland, right? And then
Yes, I think that comes later. I think that is a later interpolation, that these have become symbols of that great leap forward, that help that we had from the advanced beings. And so it has that wider association. But the most primitive meaning is to do with hand pollination.
hmm.
That was the initial, that is lighting the blue touch paper of civilization. And that's the story that the Urartians celebrate in all their sites, in their carvings, and in their cuneiform inscriptions.
So what do you think they helped us with agriculture and totally transformed our world? Do you think they had any hand in our spirituality too?
Um, Not necessarily directly. When we listen to the stories of this particular intervention, because I believe we've been visited and helped many times through the ages, the stories are fairly nuts and bolts as to the things they taught. If we listen to the Babylonian iteration of this story, we're told that they taught agriculture, civil engineering, mathematics, cosmology, writing, money systems, banking systems, legal systems. That's the syllabus. And there's not really a mention of, and they also taught spirituality, which is wonderful and expanding. There's no sort of mention of that. But in the Urartian kingdom, the United Kingdom of Van, what I did see were the elements of a response to this old story that then start moving us into spirituality and transpersonal experiences. So this was especially in evidence at Ionis, where there is the most intact sanctuary that's been left behind of the Urartian people. And it's oriented from west to east, so that in the afternoon, sunlight will shine through the passageway into this small sanctuary where the floor and the plinth were encased in alabaster. So that absorbs light. So that's going to absolutely glow with light. And then the marble decorations around the walls and the alabaster decorations on the plinth, they are further adorned with gold leaf. So this is an absolute phenomenon of light that they're creating. And they're doing this, I think, because phenomena of light were associated with the ancient visitors. They noted that the visitors, whenever they came through their doorways, there would be bright light shining through that doorway. And in a culture prior to artificial lighting, I think this was a glory to behold. So they're trying to recreate these light gates, which they carve into cliff faces, and this sanctuary filled with light for their sacred protocols. So they're standing in this phenomenon of light on a bedrock of dense magnetic rock with water flowing across it, which creates an E field. So that's going to make you feel different and more conscious and more alert. They're doing it on a high place, which itself affects us. And then the third thing they're doing is what historians, archaeologists call a libation offering. And there's a suggestion of a chalice in the carvings in this sanctuary. And I believe this is a reference to a chalice ceremony very similar to those practiced by their neighbors in ancient Persia, in Egypt, in India, in Greece. They all had protocols that involved drinking a drink that would have fermented elements, fungal elements that are designed to give you an altered state of consciousness. And the Urartians were doing all of these things in one place because I think they wanted to achieve remote communication with the Tingir. of their ancestral memory. As they did these things, of course, they are having elevating experiences. They are having experiences of altered states. And I believe it was that kind of a spirituality that the Urartians practiced, not one that, I mean, when we talk about spirituality, very often that belongs in a religious setting. To our modern minds, it belongs in a setting to do with worship or worship of a higher being, and this is slightly different to that. This is altered states to achieve contact experiences. So this would be more similar, I think, to today's ayahuasca ceremonies that you might experience in South America, which are designed to affect you and put you into a close encounter situation with other kinds of entity who hopefully will come to you as guides to support your progress. And I think that is what we're looking at in the ancient kingdom of Van.
Mm. Yeah. It's almost like an initiation almost, right? Like, with the chalice and the ceremony
It,
and
it,
how
it is, that's right. If you're thinking about initiation protocols of traditional cultures, yes, it's very much like this, only it would be done on a periodic basis. There were clearly regular touch points in which the royals and their priests or prophets would do these protocols. It wasn't something, I'm sorry to say, that the average Urartian citizen would be doing, but they would do it regularly as a touch point of, we're in touch with the powers, we're in touch with the tinger. That's why we're able to rule in their name and in their stead. I think that's part of what was going on.
do you still think there's protocols and initiations like that at that level going on today?
Oh, there are in traditional cultures, absolutely. And in my book, Echoes of Eden, I'm able to share some stories of people who've been through these initiations and they're willing to share aspects of it. I think we're in a period where we are being told a little bit more about what some of these protocols are, but we went through a long period where the imperial powers were trying to stamp them out. And so it's understandable that there's some hesitancy into letting the wider world in to know exactly what happens. But you can find these ceremonies still being practiced by traditional cultures, certainly in Africa and in South America and in Aboriginal Australia and among Native Americans.
Hmm. It's funny you say Africa. I actually just picked up this book called Stolen Legacy by George James. I don't know if you've heard of him or not.
Oh,
But
that's a good title.
he talked about how Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, has basically taken these protocols, these initiation rites from Egypt, like from these secret societies, and rites of passage almost. I literally just picked it up and just started reading it. But everything coming out of Africa. So like Socrates, but there's nothing really written. I mean, I read Plato. I'm starting to read more Plato, and he talked about Socrates, but there's nothing really written about Socrates before. You know what I mean? Like, where did he learn all of this stuff from? Right? Like, he had to get it from somewhere.
Well, there are these light references that you can find in Plato, certainly if you're reading Phaedo and Timaeus and Critias. And there, of course, Plato is writing on Socrates' behalf. Um, he says he's writing these books so that we can get a kind of eavesdrop onto what it was like being taught by Socrates, Plato being a student of Socrates. And so he makes a reference to the cult of Orpheus, the cult of Hecate, the Eleusinian mysteries. And these were cults, and we probably know the most about the Eleusinian mysteries, which were protocols practiced in Athens. And they had a near death protocol using a fermented tea with fungal ingredients in it. And I argue in the Eden series that Plato went through that ceremony, as did Socrates. I don't believe Plato's just describing something Socrates did, because he describes it in different places with such interiority. I think this is something that happened to him. And so there is a reference to wisdom from Africa, from the priests of Neith, who had informed Solon, a Greek legislator, a real historical character who had gone to Egypt, visited with these priests of Neith, listened to their wisdom, and come back, shared it with his family. So his grandson, a student of Socrates, is now a peer of Plato. So that's where Plato hears all this stuff. So he's very open about getting information from Africa, information from Egypt. But the Eleusinian mysteries, these protocols, were already established and had their own lineage. These were not something of Plato's or Socrates' creation. They went as clients to this cult that had maintained this other ancestral knowledge about how to do these near-death protocols. And it's where Plato got the idea from that when we die, we have guides coming alongside us to do our life review with us and effectively say, you can wake up now. How do you feel that went? And the reason he thinks that is because he believes he's encountered these same guides in the near-death protocols. But you've got to sort of piece it together. There's not a whole section where he describes this ceremony that he went through. It's just touched on here and there, referenced in different sections, but bring it together. And that's what it adds up to. And I think, again, it's similar to what the Urartians were doing things to alter their states of consciousness so that they could have contact experiences with advanced beings who could help them in their lives, in their rulership, and in the life of their nation.
In your book, you talk about sun crosses, and I couldn't help but think about Plato and his relationship to the sun being the truth, the good, the virtuous, right? How much how much did Plato influence Christianity?
Oh my goodness, hugely. In my book, The Invasion of Eden, I list a whole number of, they're not doctrines so much as whole forms of thought to do with life and God that the New Testament sort of takes as read and then runs with and then teaches to, that are pure Plato. And I think it's about a dozen points that I list in The Invasion of Eden, saying none of this would be in Christianity were it not for Plato. And the writers of the Gospels and New Testament very clearly knew Plato like the back of their hands, as they did international thought of that time. Those writers were scholars, and Greek thought, particularly Platonic thought, was their start point as they sat down and wrote the Gospels and New Testament. And I'm learning this late in life. If I'd gone through the British school system a generation before, I would have known that as soon as I started reading the Gospels and New Testament, because we'd have done classics at school. And so I would recognize the Greek and Roman tropes cropping up in those documents. But that really is the start point for the writers of the New Testament. And many early church fathers, very significant early church fathers, were enormous fans of Plato, absolutely open about it. People like Justin Martyr, Origen, the father of hermeneutics, Clement of Alexandria, the father of Alexandrian hermeneutics. They were all deep fans of Plato, and they saw no conflict between what Plato taught about God and human origins and extraterrestrial life and cataclysms and external interventions. All that's in Plato. They saw no conflict between that and what they wanted to say about Jesus. And that's been a revelation for me as I've done the research for the Eden series. And so you'll find a bit of Plato in every one of the Eden books, including the Eden Enigma.
Well, it's like, going back to the trigger of my question of the sun cross. I didn't realize how much of that symbol is actually in modern day Christianity. Can you talk about that?
Yes, for sure. Well, I didn't know that either when I was first ordained. I didn't notice that we were participating in protocols that were really to do with sun worship that had been brought into Christian liturgy. So the sun cross is an equal armed cross in a circle. And in Turkey, the version of that you can find is the equal armed cross, but you can see there's a curve on the edges, implying that it's in a circle. Another form of the Sun Cross is the swastika, which you can find from 8,000 years ago. The Vinca culture used it. And again, it's an equal armed cross, but it's got wings showing that it's in a circle, that it's doing a circular motion. Now, the Sun Cross, this cross within a circle, figured in my liturgical practice at the Anglo-Catholic end of the Church of England. First off, because in every image of Jesus or his mum or the saints, behind their head is a sun cross. So if you're venerating that statue or that image, you're also venerating the sun cross for some reason. If you get given a wafer at communion, you'll find a sun cross in a circle. That's what you've just been handed. And the silver ciborium that contains the wafers, on the top of it is another sun cross, equal armed cross with curved edges implying a circle. If you go to the Catholic ceremony of benediction, you've got a symbol of the sun being held up with all these golden rays coming off it, and then a wafer that is a sun cross right in the middle, and everyone sort of bows to it. If you've got statues in your church of Mary, she'll be wearing a corona, which is a symbol of the sun. And then, of course, on Easter morning, which is associated with the spring equinox, the days are now getting longer. We're going to get more sunshine. Everything's going to start happening. We face the rising sun and sing songs of resurrection. All this is sun worship, which was part of religious practice prior to Christianity, but which the Emperor Constantine brought into Christianity in the 300s, lock, stock, and barrel. So that from that time until the 1990s, when I was doing all this Anglo-Catholic liturgy, this pattern of sun worship continued unabated with just a thin veneer of Christian interpretations over the top of it. Now I look back and I think, how on earth did I miss that? But there were sort of Christian explanations for all these things that we were doing, but it belongs to something far older that relates to the sun as the center of life, the sun as a portal to another dimension, the sun, of course, as the source of all life. And many of the meanings associated with the cross were layered onto it long before the cross got brought into Christianity. So you've got those meanings, plus now you've got Sumerian meanings, because a horizontal cross refers to tax. So now it represents the one to whom you bring your tithes. A diagonal cross refers to a heavenly body. Well, of course, Jesus is a heavenly body, but that meaning's already there. Put the two together and you've got a supreme being to whom we're in perpetual debt. That meaning was there before Christianity adopted it and ran with it. But Constantine brought these things in, not just because he wanted to continue these old patterns of worship, but because he really wanted to anchor himself to Christianity so that people would begin thinking of Christian worship and good citizenship towards the emperor as being the same thing. And when he made the cross the central symbol of Christianity, and you'll note it is the equal armed cross under which his armies marched, he wanted the message to be that you're fighting for the emperor and for Jesus. God endorses this battle. And that's why he had the story of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge rewritten by a bishop, Eusebius, to make the claim that God had told him he was going to win this battle if he fought under the banner of the cross, which his armies did from that time on. So the message is Roman imperial force, Roman military violence, Roman conquests, and the place of Constantine as emperor are all God ordained. So if you're a Christian, you have to be into all this stuff. Christianity was getting popular among his soldiers, and it was a way of anchoring the story in a way that was to his benefit. And so that's what was going on in Constantine's mind, I believe, when he brought the cross into Christianity as the central symbol. Prior to that, it had not been. It was the fish that marked all the meeting places of the early Christians. He brought it in for those political reasons, but it also came with all these other associations of not necessarily sun worship, but the veneration of the sun, the celebration of the sun.
Yeah, I love this. I love it. I mean, that's where you find your true self, right? When Plato speaks about when you can finally see the sun for what it is, the truth, the good, and then you see yourself for who you are. Like the truth, you don't see yourself in another. You see yourself in your, your true essence. It's funny. I think was it Constantine said he had a dream about this symbol, right? And to put it on everything and go into that battle and win that battle. And
It
I
was
can't
a
remember what.
vision. It was a vision in the sky. So Eusebius, when he rewrites that bit of history, because he'd already written the definitive history of that battle, and Constantine said, "Could you rewrite that and just amp up this aspect of God being on my side?" And he does rewrite it. And the story is that it was a sign in the sky that everybody saw, and the words "in hoc signes vincit," conquer in this sign or under this sign, and everyone saw this cross in the sky. That's so not a dream. It was a supernatural event that was a mass sighted phenomenon, according to the second version of the story by Eusebius.
That's just great.
Oh, don't laugh, Trey. Everyone was supposed to take that absolutely seriously.
Oh, I laugh because like I could just, think about all the different books of the Bible and how much that's been, that's happened, right? And we just take it for literal and, we become
That's
fundamental.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And it's a shame because if we take it literally, we actually lose. Why was this said? What was the meaning? What did the writer really intend for you to take away from this?
Yeah, 100%. I think that's how I was early on in my faith. It was like literal. Um, I'm
Same
still
here.
trying. I'm still trying to understand what the meaning of three is. Like there's always three is so important in the
Mm.
Bible. Like the meaning of that. Jesus, the resurrection. Right. There's so many different examples of. I think it is in Kings 1 where what is the prophet? Is it I'm forgetting his name, but he prayed over the boy 3 times, for him to come back
Oh,
to
yes.
life.
Okay. Yes. So
Is it Elijah, maybe?
that's an Elijah story
Yeah.
that then gets echoed in an Elisha story.
Yeah. So it's almost like, he takes the boy up in the upper chamber upstairs. There's a uh, s something going on and he can't eat, or there's a famine going on, and so he listens to God and he goes into this woman and he tells her to bring him food and she does, and then somehow they're living together or something, and then her son gets sick and then he takes him up to the higher level in the house and prays over him 3 times and then brings him back to life. It's almost like maybe it's a premonition of Christ to come, maybe. I don't know, but that it was interesting to me that number 3 is seen throughout the Bible, and I'm just curious to your thought about the significance of that number.
Oh, there's certainly something profound about the number three, and it's long been regarded as a perfect number. It's not something that I've really studied, so I can't really speak authoritatively on the question, but there are so many interesting things about that number. I mean, if you want to create a stable structure, you're going to build triangles into it. If you want to build a stool that's going to sit straight, whatever the floor you place it on, it will have 3 legs. If you want to identify a space in time, if you want to, sorry, a pointed space, you're going to triangulate to get a location. You'll need those 3 points, your point and 2 other points, and then you've got a vector. There are so many things about the number three that are fascinating and that were important to the ancients. And it's certainly worthy of closer attention, but I haven't yet taken the time to probe
Sure,
it
man. I'll
with
send you a
my
list of all
study.
the things that I'm interested in,
Ask
and
me in another couple of years, and I might have got into the secrets of the number three.
well, I'm biased, so I am the third. So I'm named after my father, and he's named after his father. So I'm the third, and that's why they call me Trey, right? So I'm biased to the number
Oh,
three.
great! That's where you got a perfect name then.
Yeah,
The
right.
one place where I do use the rule of three is when people ask me how can they get into deeper consideration of Bible translation. I'm very fortunate that I studied modern languages at school. I learned French, German, and Latin at school, and I went on to study Italian and Portuguese and Greek, studied languages at university, then studied New Testament Greek at Theological College. And so I'm very fortunate to have that background when I come to the ancient texts and ask the questions, what do these words mean? And I have people asking me, well, how can I get into that study when I don't have that background and I can't afford an interlinear and one of these great thick lexicons? And I say, well, one of the first things you can do that is a bit more affordable, really invokes this rule of three. Get hold of two different Bible translations. And if you can afford an interlinear, you've got the advantage of you've got the English, you've got the Greek renderings word by word. But if you've got the Greek renderings and then two translations, you can sort of triangulate that because you can see, oh, they've translated that word this way, and I can see why. They've translated it this way, and I can see why. And once you've looked at two translations, you now have an understanding of what are the questions thrown up by that word. What are the possibilities? What are the vectors? What are the parameters? And it's a way you can open up the whole question of Bible translation much more affordably because you can get interlinear resources online for free. You can go to Bible Hub and you'll find the Hebrew text there and you'll find the Greek text there. And if you can just afford two English translations of the Bible, then you can start your investigations, which I have this conversation so often from week to week of people getting into this and getting so excited that they're able finally to get beyond the teaching that they may have had for a couple of decades in church life and begin to probe these questions for themselves and ask, what did the writers really mean? What were they really talking about? What did this image mean? What do these words really mean?
Yeah, well, it takes work though, it takes a lot of work, logistics to like compare and then analyze and I mean, how hard it is to like go from book to book to book to analyze and some people just
It
don't have the
is.
patience.
No, they don't. But I'm very lucky to be in conversation with people who've got a real hunger on them and a real appetite, and they're excited to get into this kind of study that they might not have had the opportunity to have done before.
Sure. No, it's great. That's great that they have the opportunity, right? And I think AI may help provide us with some more unredacted information. And I'm curious, like looking back at history, and history often repeats itself. Like, where are we headed, right? Like, do you think there's going to, what has history told us about our future, right? Like, where are we going as a not only here in the States, right? It just seems chaotic here all the time, as recently, but I mean, as a planet, as a species, like, where are we headed?
I think history tells us that human choice is always significant and that we often are governed in a way that tries to bully us out of an awareness of how powerful we are collectively. So that's part of the story that I tell in my book, The Eden Conspiracy. I actually think it's one of the central messages of the Hebrew canon when we read it in a rootsier way. And I talk about that in detail in the Eden Conspiracy, that once we translate many of the Elohim stories as God's stories, we lose some of this political, geopolitical lens through which to understand the world as we know it. Again, as I said earlier, I think we've always been in company, and I think um, we need to be intentional about what company we are building our strongest relationships with. So that's really a message for the people behind closed doors who are already in contact and working out who is here in our best interests. I don't think the decisions that were made 80 years ago are necessarily decisions that stand us in the best stead in 2025. And I think that's some of why there's some strangeness and some chaos at the moment, that these decisions really are shifting and under review in a new way. Meanwhile, you and I think, have to be very intentional about engaging our guides and experiencing contact around us for what it is, and being quite intentional about our state of mind and our emotional state. Because if we go to the Gnostic stories, for instance, about the company we're in, Gnostics talked about archontic beings who, they're not the only kind of beings who do this, but who benefit from the heavier emotional energy of biological life when it is frightened or anxious or depressed. And archons were like, what's the word? Parasitic entities that would feed off these kinds of energies, and they would manipulate human beings to being more anxious and aggressive and resentful and violent, and then they'd feed off all the energy of that. I think those stories of archons from the Gnostics are very informative for now, because if we allow ourselves to be pushed and harried into a state of anxiety and fear and anger, well, now we're very easy to govern. Now we've got divide and rule par excellence. And we have to be very conscious beings. We have to be very intentional beings of saying, I'm not going to live in that energy. I want to be a happy, healthy, curious, compassionate person. And that's exactly the kind of person and the kind of energy we need if we are going to be attractive and amenable to the right kind of help, and if we're going to be psychologically able to move our societies in healthy directions. Right now, there's a lot of chaos and there's a lot of anxiety, and there are a lot of reasons for people to be in a state of fear or a state of funk or defeatism. And I think our ancestors show us the dangers of being taken to that place. One place I'd encourage you to look is the tradition of dragon story around the world, because there's a canon of dragon story that's about 10,000 years old that talks about the importance of our psychology as a species to our evolution, and how vital it is that we go from being people who were subjects and harried and harassed and ruled over to being people who know how to talk to each other and collaborate and organize and find our own strength without always feeling that we are having to borrow strength from higher ups. And there's a pivot in dragon stories when people find each other and they find their power and they decide, no, we're going this way, not that way. And I think it's that kind of mentality we're going to need for the coming years.
Have you ever, and this is a personal question, I hope this is okay. Have you ever taken any type of psychedelic or ancient rite of passage?
No, what I use is control conscious breathing. And I found that very effective through the years at altering my state of mind, my state of consciousness, and putting me in a place where I'm more amenable to contact experiences, guidance experiences, a place of creativity. And it's that I've experimented with more than fermented drinks. I am intrigued by them. I do from time to time think, I wonder what that would be like. Wonder if I should give that a go. I have
Would
plenty of
you though?
friends who've used it.
Would you do it
But
though, if
the
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 opportunity
thing that
presented itself?
the thing that makes me nervous, if I were a tourist in South America, which I will be next month, the thing that would make me nervous of doing it is how carefully curated it is in 2025. Am I really sitting in front of someone who knows how to keep me alive through this process? And the other thing that would make me slightly nervous is I think it is possible to do those ceremonies and have a bad trip. if you've just got a little bit too much going on with you at any one moment in terms of anxiety, or if you've got some anger fermenting away somewhere, you've really got to get yourself emotionally clean if you want to have a maximally positive experience. And I'm not sure if I trust myself enough to be in the place where I think, yes, I'm ready to drink that potion now.
Set and setting. It's all about set and setting, man. I'm telling you.
Yeah.
I often wonder this for myself personally when I read texts, when I'm reading philosophy. Like if I were able to have a conversation with Socrates, like if I was able to sit down and have a beer with him, or just kind of like, before he drank the poison, like get in one last question, like what would I ask him? And you're a man of great knowledge and wisdom, and you have dove in deep into the literature. Like, what is one question that you would ask Socrates?
Oh my goodness. I've never considered that question before. I I I don't know really. I really love sitting at the feet of his student. I think I think it would be Plato I'd have a question for, because I relate very warmly to Plato. I'm such an admirer of his work. And I think probably what I'd want to know is, how can I write books that will last as long as yours, Mr. Plato? Or, or Aristocles, as I might address him more formally, because I really think it's a phenomenon that he wrote what he did with information in it that is as stretching as it is for any period in history, and then to remain in print from that time to this. I mean, everyone who trains for ministry and does a degree in theology is required to read Plato. I think that's phenomenal. I think it's amazing how much we miss, we theological students, when we read Plato, and we miss how influential he really was to Christianity, and we miss these forbidden topics that he's perfectly happy addressing. A thing I really admire him for is that he was a Renaissance man before the term was invented. So one of the reasons his students loved him is that he not only taught them philosophy and science, but he taught them wrestling. So they would wrestle together, and he was a good wrestler. And then he would teach them what we would consider philosophy, science, information about altered states, speculations about the universe. And he was very happy to do all of those things and not think, I need to focus down on my PhD thesis, which is in this tiny, very narrow field. And I think maintaining that curiosity and the energy for that throughout a lifetime, I think that's a great secret that he had. And I'd probably want to ask him about that and how he'd maintained what I feel was quite a playful spirit and a playful state of emotion and state of mind, certainly as he did his writing, because that really comes across in the way he writes. And I can only believe it came across in the way he lived and taught as well. So I think it would be questions about those things that I'd put to Plato.
Sure. So let everybody know, like, where can they find you? Where can they buy the new book,
Sure.
The Eden Enigma?
Well, you can watch me on YouTube, The Fifth Kind, and on the Paul Wallis channel. If you want to get into communication with me, I'm always in the comments and the videos from day to day. If you want to send me a longer message, come to paulanthonywallace.com. And for my books, and here's the latest, The Eden Enigma. And the subtitle of the Eden Enigma says, do ancient carvings in the mountains of Turkey carry memories of ET contact from the dawn of civilization? It's in paperback only. Unfortunately, there's no digital edition because of massive piracy of my other books. But go to Amazon, you'll find the Eden Enigma and all the other books in the Eden series.
I love it. Paul, my friend, we got to do this again sometime.
For sure. Thanks for having me on once again, Trey. It's been a pleasure.